So I just want to bid all of you a warm welcome. I think we are all like the word I describe is wisdom seekers, no? And then we value ancestral wisdom, including the insights and knowledge. So today we are featuring the third lecture in the co-learning series hosted by ASW. And we have the honor of having Miss Maria Laurie Victor. And she has been telling me that she would like to talk about her reflections on Indigenous learning of wisdom for Indigenous people's education. The reason is Maria has been really involved in IP education. No? At the same time, on behalf of all of us, we also welcome Miss Maria Isteluna Kanui. I'll introduce her more. And Dr. Wilfredo, I call him Willie Alangui. So Laurie hails from the Northern Cordillera region of the Philippines. I just came back from Baguio, so it gave me a sense of the indigenous homeland of the North. And because of November 1 and 2, so it gave me an occasion to connect with the indigenous ancestors of the North. So she belongs to the Kanganite indigenous cultural community of the Benguet province. She has been an on-call resource person for the communities in developing initiatives related to education. In fact, I myself, I've also recourse to her expertise for the Loyola School of Theology, especially our students in theology. These are the communities who request her to develop initiatives related to education. And she has been a staunch advocate of culture-based education in the context of IP communities. More popularly known in the Philippines as Indigenous people education, which has already been institutionalized through the Department of Education in this country. So with that, with a warm welcome, we would like to introduce Laurie. So Laurie, would you like to share your screen with us? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to share reflections on Indigenous people's education and uh, the key questions of how is ancestral wisdom learned and how can it be taught. So I'll just share po.
Sige po. Tiyanan ko na. All right.
Okay. So thank you. I'll also stop video for now just to conserve bandwidth. So um, when uh, when Father Giorgio mentioned about the invitation to share, I felt that uh, given where I am and what I could share from my experience, it would be more appropriate for me to share from the angle of the advocacy for Indigenous people's education. So for this afternoon, just for us to have an overview of what will be the highlights of the sharing, first, just a brief background about the Indigenous peoples in the Philippines, and then an overview about the Indigenous peoples education advocacy, also in the Philippines, and what have been the emerging articulations regarding learning and knowing in in Indigenous peoples communities, and together let us reflect on how is wisdom evoked. Um, I will share later why I'm using the word evoked and not learned. The key questions that will, in a way, which we will revolve around would be how is ancestral wisdom learned? So that was the original way it was articulated. And how can this wisdom be taught? Um, as I will be sharing, I felt it more appropriate to share as much as possible from the words of our community elders and leaders as we journeyed in this effort for Indigenous people's education. So how I'm hoping to share how their wisdom was also shared to us. I'm hoping it will come out that way.
Okay.
So, um, so yes, it's an effort to share from their voices, hopefully, and to uh, yeah, to articulate from their life experience. So to also share where the sharings are coming from, it would be coming from our work with the Agta and Mangyan communities. The Agta are in the Quezon province, that would be southern Luzon, and the Mangyan communities would be in Mindoro Island. I can show it a little more later. Then for some time also, I had a chance to work with the Episcopal Commission on Indigenous Peoples of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines. So in the Philippines, the Catholic Church has a network of um, what we call Indigenous Peoples ministries or apostolates, and one of their advocacies is Indigenous Peoples education. So for quite some time, they really put effort into consolidating the experiences of their work with IP communities. So that's another source of the sharings. And more recently, I have been working with the Department of Education of the Philippine government, and in the process of institutionalizing the Indigenous Peoples Education Program of the department, there again were opportunities to encounter community elders and leaders, and also our field workers who also share their experiences. So we start with an overview of the indigenous peoples in the Philippines. The rough estimate is that there are around 12 to 17% of the total population. Most of them, actually, most of us are in Mindanao. So that's 61% would be in Mindanao, 33% would be in Luzon, and in these islands in the middle, around 6%. Again, these are rough estimates because we our government figures are not accurate. We do not have an accurate number yet or census of our IP communities. In the government, the indigenous peoples communities have been subdivided into what are called ethnographic groups. So there are 7 of them, as you can see in the color coding. And I think one basis for that is there are areas of being interrelated among these groups. Now, the context of the groups we call indigenous peoples in the Philippines is heavily coming from the colonial experience, where uh, peoples were grouped. So the colonial mindset and the colonial way of looking at peoples was, in a way, two groups. Not two groups. You would have what they call the uncivilized pagans, the wild races, and then they also labeled other ethnicities or other cultural groups as Hispanized, Christianized groups. One term used was the Indio. No? So in time, if we go through time, the groups that were considered uncivilized, pagan, wild races with those kinds of labels are mostly those who are today considered indigenous peoples in the Philippine context. So sometimes there's a question of, aren't all the people in the Philippines indigenous? Now, so yes, all peoples in the Philippines are indigenous, but when we take into consideration the historical context, there are particular ethnicities who were able to maintain and continue in varying degrees their practices, their governance structures that were transmitted before the colonial period. And these communities who are still able to carry that out today, again in varying degrees, no? These are the peoples who are considered indigenous peoples in the Philippine context. Now, just to share briefly, since I'll be sharing more on the education angle in the country and also in the sharing, just to give a quick profile about our IP learners. How many learners are there? Let's say in basic education, in the public school setting, no? So in the public school, if this is as of school year 2019-2020, there are around 2,500,000 Indigenous peoples learners in the public schools, and that would be about 11% of all public school learners, and they would be in around 41,000 schools. That would be varying numbers. So whether it is one learner or 100% enrollment of IP learners, around 41,000 of our schools have IP learners. But if we try to look at schools whose enrollment is purely Indigenous learners, that would be around 1,500 or so schools. Now, the enrollment of 100% IP learners is not because government segregates them. There's no policy of segregation. It just so happens that the school is located in an area where it is really dominantly IPs, and therefore the enrollment will become 100% IP learners. So in other schools, it will be mixed. No? There will be a mix of Indigenous peoples and other ethnicities. In the private sector also, there are around 250 plus thousand learners in the private schools. 11,000 of these schools have IP learners, and in the private schools, around 142 schools have 100% IP learners. Again, these schools would most likely be in areas that are dominantly IPs. That's why the enrollment reaches 100%. Now, just to summarize how the perspectives about education in relation to IP communities evolved in the country, because of the lack of time, I'm trying to synthesize it into three waves of perspectives that we experience in the Philippines. So first, there is education for assimilation. Then there is what we call education for Indigenous peoples communities. And more lately, we have what we call Indigenous peoples education. So to understand, just to provide highlights. So what is education for assimilation? The assumption in this perspective is that Indigenous peoples communities are not educated and are illiterate. So they're not educated, they're not illiterate, and therefore the purpose is to remove the Indigenous culture of the learners as they learn the cultures of the dominant society. So it's really, the idea is these children will forget, or they will become more Filipino. They will lose their cultural background. They become quote unquote Filipinos, and that will make them they become part of the dominant society. So the process is to provide uniform education services. So whatever is the kind of education in all other schools, it should be the same for them. Then later on, there was a change, a kind of a change. For our purposes, let's call it education for IP communities. The assumption here is still that IP communities are not educated and are illiterate, but let us respect their identity. No? So the assumption about being uneducated and being illiterate is still there, but the difference now is let us value their identity. Now, the purpose of this type of education is to enable these learners to be respected, but their being respected will be because they are educated and they are successful in the wider society. Okay, so they get respected as Indigenous peoples, but that respect is premised on being educated and being considered successful according to the parameters of the wider society. And so the process is provide uniform education services still, but let us ensure that there is a touch of cultural elements. So they get to know about, particular aspects of their culture, what outsiders would consider as the good things, like the dances, the songs, and things like that. The clothing, perhaps, some artifacts. So that these are the earlier waves of perspectives when it comes to education services and IP communities. Now, these two perspectives, unfortunately, had certain impacts. And these are the major impacts that have been observed based on the stories that have been gathered through consultations. One, schooling is a venue for discrimination because the view is still there that Indigenous peoples are less. So the discrimination continues. It can be with teachers, classmates, the teaching methods, the evaluation tools, school management. There is a the way of doing these things is discriminatory to the communities. Schooling is also an experience of non-being because you don't see yourself there. You do not see your stories, for example. You do not see the context of your communities there. The knowledge and way of life of the community is considered backward or invalid, and community context is not addressed. If there are efforts to discuss or include the culture of the community, it tends to be a quote unquote surface culture. So it does not allow or it does not go as far as understanding indigenous peoples as peoples and appreciating culture as a process. It tends to be about artifacts. It tends to be about objects, things like that. So the impacts when it comes to the learners are have been the following. First, learners still have a difficulty in learning the needed competencies. They sometimes lose the respect for their culture and heritage. Well, not some. For a time, no, many would lose their respect for their culture and heritage. There's a tendency to have low self-esteem, a sense of shame, and a loss of identity in the process. For those who are able to go through the system or to go through the process, they tend to focus on their own success. And sometimes they can become an agent of community disunity. One way it has been articulated is those who have studied are the ones who end up duping their own community members. So just because they know how to calculate because of math, now they are the ones who tend to dupe their own community members in terms of documents or in terms of calculations and things like that. So definitely there is something in that process. There's something wrong. There's something definitely that needs to be addressed. And therefore, there arose this whole advocacy for what we today call Indigenous people's education. And to summarize, what its main assumption is that Indigenous people's communities have a system of education. So there is that recognition that education has been there since time immemorial. And therefore, the purpose of Indigenous people's education is to forward the respect for Indigenous peoples in terms of identity, history, their sense of community, including self-determination. And the process is what we call ancestral domain-based education. So this is now the recent development. And the good thing is at least one step that has been taken is the national education system is now also moving towards implementing and advocating Indigenous people's education. Now, of course, these changes were brought about by continued community assertions. Really, Indigenous people's education is a product of the community's efforts to advocate for what they felt is the appropriate kind of education for them. It just so happened, of course, that through the years, through the decades, there has been support at the international and national level through laws, through policies, through articulations, no? Like Education for All, Millennium Development Goals. These all contributed so that the Indigenous people's education advocacy could be propagated and have deeper roots in the country. Now, I'd like to share, at this point, I'll be sharing now the journey, like snippets of the journey of the advocacy. In the early years, particularly in the 2000, the first 2000 to around 2005, 2010, the IP education advocacy was relatively young. What was more dominant and what was more familiar was the advocacy for the ancestral domains. So there were communities who were really, trying to discern. Should we send our children to school? We are seeing the negative impact of schooling on our children. Isn't the school causing us to lose our children? So that question would be a point of reflection in different parts of the country. But if we were to distill one major point that came out through the years, and that became the basis why we decided to move forward and engage the Department of Education, was I share it according to how one community articulated it. They said, when bitten by a snake, the cure is its venom. So they were the analogy would be, uh, education is a process that can cause harm, but it can also be the process that can heal. And so their assertion was that education is not the problem. No? Going to school per se is not the issue. What we want to have is an education that can heal. And that's why they were saying we need to push forward with indigenous people's education. Now, another point of another way that not another way, the way they articulated the kind of education that can heal would be how to characterize the learners. If they go through this indigenous people's education, what will the learners be like? So again, as a summary of the varied reflections that were consolidated, they were saying our learners should be rooted in their culture, in their indigenous knowledge systems and practices, and in the ancestral domain. They should grow up with a clear sense of identity in terms of who they are, their ethnicity, and then of course being a Filipino also, but their sense of uh, belongingness to their ethnic group should be clear to them. Hopefully, their education will nurture their growth and commitment to face issues of the community. So what they learn should be in the service of how the community can face their issues and concerns. And in the process, they contribute to the assertion of self-determination of the community. And that also, they grow up being conscious of being inheritors of a heritage and becoming an elder of coming generations. So this is how more or less they were articulating what an IP learner should become if we have indigenous people's education. And then they were also trying to reflect, no, what is the importance of indigenous people's education? Why do we need to do this? Is it because we want our children to succeed? Is it because we want them to be at par with the rest of society? I think the more essential point that was raised was again shared using an analogy. And they were saying that we are advocating for our ancestral domains, right? So okay, we are struggling and we are doing so much. We have done so many. We have done so much to struggle for the ancestral domains. But if our children do not value the ancestral domains, then even if we have our ancestral domains, even if let's say we win or we are victorious in having our ancestral domains, if the younger generations do not understand the value of the ancestral domains, how to take care of it, then our community well-being and our community well-being will slowly deteriorate. Our communities will be gone. No? So they were saying that um, the analogy used was a bird, that community well-being and self-determination has two wings, the ancestral domain and IP education. Because the ancestral domain is the home, IP education will ensure that there are succeeding generations who will know how to care for the ancestral domain. And so with that insight guiding us, we clearly we had a clearer idea of what IP Ed is about. So using again the imagery of a bird and the wings. So one push that came out in the process is, okay, if we want to advocate for indigenous people's education, we need to articulate our education system as indigenous people. So we have an educational system that is clear, no? That was clearly at some point that became clearly articulated, because earlier the idea that IP communities have no education was, quite a strong voice. But later on, as more reflections came in, it became clear that, we have to question that assumption that we are not educated. Because why is it that we have these knowledges today? No? So at some point, it became clear that no, we have an education system, but we need to articulate it so that the bigger society can also understand it. If we are to advocate this, let's say with the Department of Education or with the wider society, we have to articulate our education system. And so that process now became the next major step for the many indigenous people's education advocates in the country. We have to remember our own education systems and processes. So again, I'd like to share uh, the articulations coming from some insights when we would do the consultations in the earlier years. This picture, this sign, this what's this? These words were posted in one school, and I'm translating it here. Best effort to translate it from Filipino to English. It says, "Our ancestors taught us, without the land there is no culture. If there is no culture, there will be no humankind." So the understanding of culture is really in relation to the land. And the understanding of being human is in relation to this thing called culture. So the human relation to the land somehow generates this thing called culture. And therefore, these three are closely interconnected. At least that's how it was being articulated. No? Without the land, there is no culture. If there's no culture, there will be no humankind. Then another articulation that was shared is uh, we are students with a very vast book. In Filipino, tayo ay mga mag-aaral na may malawak na libro. So we are students with a very vast book, referring to creation. So again, education or the learning is seen in relation to all creation that is around us. Another insight that was shared was, learning is from before birth. In some communities, they would say it's before birth. In others, they will say it is from the womb. Now, even if you're in the womb, you're already learning. But others say it is before birth because they will talk about the dreams of the parents. And then it is even after death, because even when you are in the other world, there's still a connection with this world, and there are obligations. In fact, there are responsibilities expected of those who pass on to the other world, and therefore you have to learn what responsibilities those are. No? So learning has to continue even if you are in the other world already, so that you can perform your responsibilities in relation to those in the land of the living. So something like that. So putting that together, we can synthesize that and kind of capsulize it into learning really is with and from the ancestral domain. The ancestral domain really is the home and the place for learning. And learning is lifelong. So the concept for the concept, for example, of education, lifelong learning and education for life. I mean, these are things inherent to the indigenous system of education. Also, because it is lifelong, it is a community act and it is intergenerational. The learning is with and through the generations, and it is something that is happening with everybody in the community. So that's one important articulation that came out. No? Then another insight from one of our workshops. Just to give a background, of course, in the mainstream education system, when we are, let's say, designing lessons or designing the curriculum, we categorize, or we ask, what is the knowledge, what is the skill, what is the values, and then we put it together. That is what you teach in class. But teachers are taught that you have to identify what is the concept, what is the skill, and what is the values. No, then you should design your lesson in relation to these three. So one time we were discussing in one community about a particular topic, and so we were asking the teachers, okay, so what is the concept there? What is the knowledge? What is the skill? What is the values? And there were elders with us because we were also asking them to share their thoughts. No, and then one elder said, "Why do you separate knowing from doing from the values? Why is it that you segregate?" No? He said, "Aren't they one? When you do, you know, and it should be with conviction." So if we try to understand, if you try to glean from that comment or that point being raised by one of the elders, it will really reflect how learning is from at least their perspective, from the indigenous way of learning. It's very integrative and associative. You don't box them like this is the concept, this is the skill. I mean, at least they found it unusual because from their perspective, it's one. No? To act means and when you act, it should be with conviction. It's one thing, which is different from how we are taught in education, in mainstream education courses, that you have to identify the concept, you have to identify the skill, and you have to identify the values. Um, it has a bearing, I think, on how we also learn. Because, for example, today we have, or for me personally, the example I give about the impact of this breaking of understandings, or having boxes, is why is it that we all know? I remember we studied this in grade 3. In grade 3, we know that the human body is 75% water. We learned that. Everybody knows that. So everybody who has gone to school would know that 75% of our bodies is water. Some would even say 80, no? So my question is, why is it that we pollute water? I mean, if we know it, why is it that our living is dissonant with our knowing, right? Why is it that we are destroying, for example, the planet when we learn so much about life when we are in school? No, we understand this concept. We talk about ecology. I mean, so there's something there. The way we are learning and the way we are teaching, it seems, is reflecting that breaking of things into components, and there is something there that is affecting us. So we now live in a world where we know the concept, but we do not have the practice or the behavior that should go with it. So yeah, that's one of the things that has been raised. And then as seen here in the illustration, the harvest, for example, no? Harvesting, there's a science there, but if we have a chance to dialogue with the community leaders and the elders regarding the experience of harvest, they will express it in faith terms. They will also talk about it in what we would consider philosophy. They would also describe it in ways that we would consider as aesthetics. But for them, it is one. It's not distinct fields of understanding. Also, the learning by experience is very deep. So experiencing and being immersed in the experience and learning from the experience is very deep in indigenous communities, at least based on what has been coming out in the consultation. So uh, that's in fact one reason why sometimes the classroom way of study tends to be boring, or it's not engaging IP learners. Now you can just imagine a child, an IP learner by age of 5 years old, knows a lot already about insects, and then when he or she goes to kinder class, it tends to feel so childish, like there's more experience outside really than in the classroom, something like that. There's a lot of experience, and in that experience, there's a lot of learning. And then another insight one time was we were discussing about science. Again, this was part of our effort to see how community knowledge can be connected to what is being taught in our classrooms. No? So one time we were talking about science, and it so happened that the topic was about the five senses. So, smell, taste, being able to see, ganyan. And then one elder at some point raised this question. He was saying, how about the inner senses? How about things like beauty, like purity of intention, uh, sensing the sacred, the sense of justice. And then he said, there are inner senses. Are these also taught? So, um, of course, we were in science. No, we were in science in a session on science. But again, if we sit and reflect with what that elder was sharing to us, it really makes you think, because really, how does our present kind of education harness and teach us about what this elder calls inner senses? It's different now if I say it in Filipino, but this is the best I think that I could do in terms of English. Now, he was saying that beauty is not, you cannot sense beauty using the five senses. Also, the purity of intention of other people, or he yeah, we know we can sense, uh the we can sense other people's intentions, and how's this, when people relate with us, I mean, we have a sense of that, and they cannot be in the five, they're not in the five senses, the sense of the sacred, the sense of justice. So again, it makes us realize that in the indigenous way, there are, of course, the outer senses, but there are also deep inner senses. And how much effort and how much attention are we really paying attention to these inner senses? And then in the process also of discussions, we realized that indigenous communities have their own educational psychology. Much of our all of our educational no Most of our educational psychology that we learn, at least here in the Philippines, is very Western. There is now, of course, there's a growing movement now for Filipino psychology, but I think it would really benefit the country if we also learn from the educational psychology of our IT communities, and also how learning is organized, how what is called curriculum. IT communities also have their own curriculum, and they have, for example, this is one articulation in one of the Mangyan communities in Mindoro. They have their own growth stages, and they have their own expectations of what are learned for each growth stage. We just need to have time to listen and learn from them. And then another important characteristic of indigenous communities, at least in the Philippine context, is the oral transmission of knowledge. Orality. It is a different way of knowing and being. No, the oral way of communication. How memory, associative thinking, linguistic intelligence, how context is very important in an oral society. Musical intelligence, the chanting with music. No? All of these are a crucial component
Thank you.
in the community's way of life. And so this is one aspect also that is not given as much attention by the education system we have at the moment. Another aspect that has been raised is that learning learning, the storage of knowledge, and the transmission of knowledge is in multiple forms. So it can be through dance, through music, through chanting, movement, story. So dance, for example, is not only for it's not for entertainment. It is really a way of storing and transmitting knowledge. It's really unfortunate these days that it has been uh, what's this? It has been limited to entertainment, not even the music. Um, but yeah, that is very close to what we today call multiple intelligence. So what tends to be seen as entertainment is actually a way of storing and transmitting knowledge. So, for these learners, the AITA learners in Central Luzon. And then another insight that was shared, and I think this is quite important, is it was articulated in several ways. I'm sharing here two ways it was articulated. Our spirituality is what holds all that we know together. That was one way one elder put it. Another said, our spirituality is at the center and all that we know is held together. Yeah? I remember after hearing this, I think a year or two later, I had to do another sharing. and I had to look into the word the religion, really, I think it's to bind. No? So if we will listen to what the elders are saying, knowledge knowledge is a spiritual thing. Knowledge is a spiritual experience. It's not, it cannot be separated. Again, they are saying that it's our spirituality that holds all that we know together. It is at the center, and all that we know is held together. So that dimension is very crucial for IP communities. It is not a separate domain. Again, no, it permeates. That's another way probably to imagine it. All that is known is in relation to that dimension, because that dimension holds all these knowledges together. So the sense of the sacred and the secular today in education, no? There is that sense of this is sacred, that's secular. It's not like that. There's no dichotomy. And one dimension of that experience is what others call revealed knowledge. Knowledge that comes through dreams, knowledge that comes with the capacity to communicate even with other creatures. So these are some of the major points that have been shared in terms of the nature of indigenous knowledge systems. And again, the articulation of learning and education being embedded or being committed to nurturing the ancestral domain and life. There is that sense of being life. Now, the conviction to care for life is there. So the learning, that is the transmission of the knowledge, is towards the community's well-being. And the community has to care for all these aspects. That is very clear in the articulations of the elders. So after several years now and consolidating all this, we can really see that indigenous peoples have an education system. Only it is different. It is really different from what we are used to for those of us who have gone to school in the formal way. It will mean, if we will try to summarize, no, there is a need, if we are to advocate for it, there's a need to remember our own education systems and processes. Critical to that process is reconnecting with elders who are culture bearers and knowledge holders. There is a need to remember the values and meanings in relation to practices, beliefs, and community governance mechanisms. The values and meanings are crucial. It's not just the practice itself, because too often there's a tendency to focus on how to do, and the meaning and the meaning and the reflection behind the act sometimes is not given as much attention. And critical in this process is remembering the sacred connection with one's people and the ancestral domain. So it is important that IP education also contributes to revitalizing community institutions. The processes of reflecting together, the governance systems, how communities experience the sacred, for example, because again, it holds all that is known together. Now, this kind of experience of learning and education, I think, is what makes possible words of our elders, which I will be sharing next, like the words of Makliing Dulag. Makliing Dulag is one of our community elders, and he is known for words he shared when our communities were, especially in the north. He is from the north. When we were asserting that we were asserting against the building of dams at the time in the 80s, in the 1980s, no? And the communities were saying no to the dams. And this was his articulation about the land. No? Afokafunyan gave us life and placed us in the world to live human lives. And where shall we obtain life? From the land. To work the land is an obligation, not merely a right. No? It's very interesting that he says it is an obligation and not just a right. In tilling the land, you possess it. Now, to clarify, the idea of possession here is not individual personal possession. It's more of, if you cultivate, then it shows that it makes the whole community see that, okay, you are responsible enough for that, and therefore you 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 can be trusted with that. No, it's not possession in the personal private sense that we know the word possession. And he says land is a grace that must be nurtured. No? Land is a grace. To enrich it is the eternal exhortation of Afo Kafunyan to all of Kafunyan's children. Land is sacred, land is beloved. From its womb springs our Kalinga life. So I think the kind of education of our communities brings about this kind of way of speaking and articulating about the land, the communities, and our relationship with it. It's going to be very different from, let's say, an economic or even a political way of talking about land, no, and our relationship with the land. Another way, other words, no, from again from the communities, from the elders. Magbabaya is a term for the creator in the south of the Philippines. So it is Magbabaya who owns the land. We are only Magbabaya stewards. Again, this is translated into English. I really wonder, you know, if I knew their language, I wonder if stewards would be the approximation. No? Or own, I wonder if own would be the word that would be used. Another one would be land is a gift from Magbabaya to a people he has put in place in order to develop and guard creation. As a divine gift, it could not be owned by anyone, for one cannot own that which gives life. So again, it comes from a very different understanding of how we understand land or the place of creation and who we are in relation to all creation. Now, by chance, someone sent this post, and what caught my attention was the way Pope Francis talked about wisdom. He was actually talking about the dangers of social media. I'd like to zero in on what he said here. Yeah. He says, true wisdom as the fruit of self-examination, dialogue, and generous encounter between persons. So he talks about wisdom in that way. But he says, just to complete the thought, he says, true wisdom as the fruit of self-examination, dialogue, and generous encounter between persons is not acquired by a mere accumulation of data, which eventually leads to overload and confusion, a sort of mental pollution. So that was the thought of Pope Francis. I wanted to zero in on what he said about true wisdom as the fruit of self-examination, dialogue, and generous encounter between persons. So that caught my attention. Then it made me remember another sharing of that community elders. They were saying all of creation has life. And another one said, all creation is alive. Lahat ng bagay ay may buhay. Lahat ng bagay ay buhay, no, in Filipino. So all creation has life, or another is all creation is alive. And so it suddenly came back to me, you know, that we encounter being to being, not subject to object. So Pope Francis was talking about the encounter, no, the encounter of persons to persons. In the indigenous experience, it is an encounter of I'm a living being, the water is a living being. The air is a living being, the mountains are living beings. And therefore, I relate with it as a being and not as an object. They are subjects as much as I am a subject. And therefore, we relate subject to subject. And that is a different way of being, and it's a different, therefore, a different way also of knowing and learning about other beings. One example I give is, you do not say, I study my parents, right? You say, I relate with my parents. You do not say, I study my brother and sister and I will, look at their vital statistics. No, you don't say that. You say, I know my brother, but I know my brother and sister. So if I will share about them to others, it is coming from a relational knowing. It is not because they became objects which I studied and I got data about them and therefore I will share about them. But I think that is one thing that has happened, no? The divide between us human beings and the rest of creation, where it now has become, the encounter now is between a subject and objects instead of being to being. So that one that caught my attention. No? And I remember the words of the elders. So this kinds of understanding is now what makes possible um, how indigenous communities can contribute to this whole discourse of caring for creation. And so we get to read literature saying that these communities are repositories of vast accumulation of traditional knowledge. Their experiences link humanity with ancient origins, and that much can be learned from them in terms of sustainably managing very complex ecological systems. No? So these affirmations are coming out, especially today. But again, that all that is possible because of that way of knowing and being. And so, um, the next question now, the second question is, so how can this be taught? I mean, uh, can it be taught? And now I'd like to share very briefly, as we are about to end, our brief experience in the Indigenous Peoples Education Program in DepEd. So the department now has officially included Indigenous learning systems and Indigenous knowledge systems and practices in the national education system. And so one of our major efforts is what we call curriculum contextualization, where we connect the cultural dimension of the community with what is learned in class in the different subjects. But this is now the emerging reflection coming out. And after like 7 years of observing the process, several communities are now saying that, there are indigenous ways that can be learned in school, but there are others that can be learned in a non-formal way, and there are others that can only be learned in the community. And so what is emerging now is that indigenous people's education will have to be an interplay of the formal system and then what we call the non-formal system, the ones for adults usually, and the community itself. And based on the reflections coming out so far, it seems that wisdom, if we will, if we will use the term, is something that we need to grow into, and it's not something that can be taught the way we understand thought. And it is something that needs to be experienced by the learners. That's why they were saying, okay, there is something that can be learned in school, but ultimately, the community, the experience in the community, it seems will be the integrative process for our learners. So again, I felt it would be good to return to the images earlier expressed by the community elders and leaders, that IP Ed will really have to continue being rooted in that sense of uh, community that is intergenerational in relation to the ancestral domain. And again, ultimately, it needs to be experienced with all of creation. So while the school process is there, it's crucial that the communal collective experience be sustained and nurtured in the community itself. So the challenge really will be how our schools will really, how our schools will grow in being facilitators of education in the context of the whole community. It's the community that will allow our learners to synthesize all that they learn together. And so, the journey for the Indigenous people's education advocacy continues. And as we move forward, we are hoping to uh, find ways so that these reflections can be actualized in terms of practice and policy in our education system and in our schools and in our communities. So, yeah, I will end here. And I hope this helps to make us both reflect and connect with these gems of wisdom that have been shared to us about indigenous wisdom and how it can be carried on, how it can be transmitted through the coming generations. So again, thank you to everyone, and I hope we can reflect further together.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Laurie. That the community is the context, is the source, no, of learning. And if we have to learn the wisdom, it has to be cultured, no, by the community, and the community is very much in touch with the earth. And then I think, yeah, that the talk about the living being is very important. That the living being of the water, of the mountain, the living being of the ancestors, of all things, continue to help us to grow in that wisdom. No? Yeah, thank you so much. Our first respondent is really Maria Esteluna Canoia, who earned her master's in social anthropology at the Ateneo de Manila University. Now, she's also an IPC Ford Foundation Scholar, batch 19, from the year 2003 to 2005. You know? What is very fascinating is, being a director, the executive director of the Kitanglat Incorporation. She has been a staunch advocate of indigenous cultural knowledge in the governance of the biodiversity and conservation of the natural park, especially located within the ancestral homeland of the Talaandig, the Bukidnon, and Higanon tribes. This is really part of the South. She's also an avowed advocate of the ancestral domain sustainable development protection plan. In other words, the indigenous leaders and the community must come together and then discuss how they would like to sustain the ancestral domain, how they would like to develop it so that it is a culture-based development as well. So with that, I'd like to all of us to welcome Miss Maria Esteluna Canoia. Yeah. Okay. Chai, over to you. Thank you.
Yeah. Good afternoon to all, and thank you, Laurie, for the sharing very comprehensive presentation on the genesis of IP education. At the same time, there's a struggle and a way forward. And I really appreciate also the presentation, very logical, and I was very excited to answer some of those questions you posed to us. But basically, I was trying to understand how I could also factor in my experience working with indigenous people for, I would say, 30 years here as an anthropologist in Mindanao. And The bottom line, there are really very important things. When we talk about the ancient wisdom, the wisdom keepers, the wisdom of indigenous people, the elders, um, what are the elements that we need to see? Um, the simple bottom line is that very basic when I was beginning my interaction with them is that the first impression that I know is that from a simple conversation, you would know that their worldview talks about connection of life and nature, even in a simple conversation. And then the importance of family, kinship, um, how to maintain that relationship, and always about the value, the virtue of giving and receiving, that is nature. So the first teacher for them is actually nature. And how even for simple things you can see the perspective. Even in the person, a member of the family who is not present in the household, who happens to be on a hunting, and then how he is being represented at home. So this is basically like part of Filipino values, but we didn't know because it was not taught. And it's a good thing that Lori point out the differences in the formal education and non-formal education. And I had a chance to be invited by the Department of Education in Davao, Region 11, and they asked me to share about knowledge. And those present in the audience are actually teachers, supervisors of the PED. And I said, like, wow, how much my approach to education. Good Lori has all the statistics about learners, but I will focus on process like, how do you learn wisdom? And there's actually two types of knowledge. I emphasize that one. The explicit knowledge and the tacit and hidden. Implicit knowledge. So we are in the domain of explicit knowledge. Knowledge that is can be put into an artifacts, can be coded, put in a database, can be put in a picture, can be recorded, and can be listened to. And that to have that knowledge, you have it's an easy transfer of knowledge. Tacit implicit knowledge is something to do with how you recognize the world. It's an internal value system, and it's not coded, sad to say. And the transfer of the information has nothing to do like for you to memorize. No, it's not banking education that the teacher teaches the student and then gets the measure learning by through exams. So it's a banking system education, so what we call it before. And yes, but implicit tacit knowledge is really a lived experience. Like for a daughter or the son of an indigenous person is to walk with parents and elders in the university of life, and it's true, they have the whole world as their classroom. Ancestral domain is their university. There's no borders by constructed classrooms. In fact, the aspirations that we have with I have an NGO that looks at indigenous leadership that nurtures this kind of education that Lori is putting forward. That should be the way forward. It should be integrative. It's a combination of formal and informal. But it should be a nurtured space, and we don't have that space yet now. So that's very important in looking at indigenous wisdom. And then very clear also from that conversation is the connection to land, as I mentioned, connection to nature, that no identity, no culture if there's no ancestral land, there's no land. A human being in the cultural structure should be stepping on land. That's why land is so important to the indigenous people. And an ancestral domain-based education is very important. What do you see in a very high biodiversity area? So look at my background. That's a part of our trekking with the steps to Mount Kitanglad. How many ferns do you see? How many small biodiversity that cannot be seen in the naked eye? It's not just about the eagles. The flora resources of Kitanglad is, I would say, only 20% studied compared to mammals, birds, and other animals and wildlife. And there's so much of that. Dato Makapukaw aspires to do a cultural profiling, not a research. He said, when you research, you don't know. But when you codify, you document, you profile, because you know. This is the approach to put in knowledge into context, into a material, into a paper, because they know that in this information age, if the elders are very afraid to share about knowledge because sacred traditions are oral, what would happen to the descendants if somebody asks, what's the legend of Mount Kitanglad? And if we're aspiring to have more schools for living traditions, what references would they have? If, for instance, that elder historian already passed away, so we started thinking about the practicality of writing about their culture from their own point of view. So it's also a compromise with the information age of society. Third is that language is very important. When I visit to the communities, especially in Kitanglad, the kids are very fond of speaking their Binukid language, and it's very good. And then when they enter to public school, they speak the Bisaya, which is the common lingua franca for everybody to understand. But back in their community, they talk about the importance of their language. And it should form part in the sphere of indigenous education. It should be in their language. And I'm glad Lori also mentioned about spirituality. Spirituality is very important because when it is passed with deep reverence with the unseen elements of nature, because for the elders, they introduce the world to the children through storytelling by introducing the unseen elements, and we need to respect that. And as an anthropologist interacting with elders, if I need to ask very serious question, I should be prepared with my 1 peso coin and a white cloth. Put it. It's a simple right to ask question. Why? Because I would say, may I consult your spirit guide about certain things? So they also say that knowledge is not just personal, but it's also an interactive relationship with unseen beings, also are guardians of nature. That's why for the tribe, especially those in the culture, um, they're not forest guardians for the sake that the government deputize them. No way. Here in Kitanglad, we are witnesses to tribe forest guardians because they have a very clear perception and concept of territoriality. I take care. I take care of the waters, the sources of water, the land, the air. So they know they have a responsibility. And you are entering the community, how do you capture that into an educational system? That fits really in a open space venue, landscape. So I hope that there will be kinds of discussion like this with that ed. And so we pick those hints, signposts, that indeed there's so much of the education system, although it's already open to indigenous system, to making it indigeneity. But the teachers are still educated in a colonial framework. So when you are in the ancestral domain territory, how do you learn intuition? How do you communicate trusting your gut? How do you decide on matters listening to the omens? How do you know that it's a day to plant? Reading the stars, the cosmology, all of nature's cooperating. It's happening, it's still happening here. In fact, in 2016, when we had successive forest fires, and like Tanglad is 47,000 hectares of about 8 localities, and on the same day, all locations have forest fire incidents. And it's in terms of management that's so difficult. So what we did, we summoned all the elders, all the ritualists, come to kin office. Can we do a ritual to summon the rain? And we had that ritual. Did it rain? Yes. In the afternoon, at least it minimized the spread of fire. So ritual has a role. But how do you impart that in a classroom? No. Because you cannot just act like in a chatter, like this is like the ritual, this is what you're supposed to do. In schools for living tradition, they'll learn in actuality, real time. And when this the elder knows that this child is privileged for that information, but also depends on the interest of the child. They look at the inclination, the interest, the way the child speaks, the way the child approach elders, plays with playmates. As early as that, the pupil is already being concerned. In fact, still when the birth, they also look for omens. Like this child is gonna be a good leader. They know that. So there's a communication even when the child is still not yet formed into a child, and they have rituals to ensure that the child would have a clear direction for the future. So that's also education, but we don't also like include that. But it's part of the educational psychology, indigenous psychology. So there's a field for that. But no one's really doing it, and I'm very glad Father Jojo opened this space uh, that allows us to discuss these things, because we need to nurture this kind of space. And I'm glad the ASEAN School of Wisdom continues to make an effort for everyone here in the room to have a grasp about these realities and bring this kind of realities to your space where you think it is relevant. Another thing in the point of learning is not just the teacher and the student, because like in the Manyans, the teacher is even like in a lower position. It's a structure in the building, because if the teacher is up, that means it's her all wisdom and everybody just have to listen. No, it's a reverse. In the structure of the classroom, it's the students is up because the wisdom is collective, and the teachers kind of facilitate it. So it's a wonderful thing. Even the formation of the school is very important. And of course, all of indigenous wisdom is earned through trust. If there's no genuine friendship, supportive relationship. I am a non-IP, but I work with the indigenous people as an anthropologist. I learned through others who walked ahead of me, who taught me like Easter, when you enter ancestral domain, take off your shoes, walk, walk barefooted, do not wear sunglasses, like a metaphor. Do not see things that you see from your world and you interpret in their world. It's very important you capture what they recognize in you, what they recognize in the world, and they tell the story. They reveal it to you, because that's a important value system. So things cannot be rushed. And education is like active life, no cramming. But when disaster is coming, you know how to pray, summon the wind spirit, the water spirit, the earth spirit. Make the disaster, if it's a big disaster, make it small for us to bear. Ritualists, they will say, they communicate to the spirits that governs the disaster, the elements of nature, because they know how. When it's taught from their ancestors, it's a passed on traditions to make it bearable. They do not pray like, transfer this strong typhoon to Cagayan de Oro, because the people there are messy. They pollute the waters. But they pray for humanity. They pray for all of human beings survive. They pray for forgiveness. Sad to say, Filipinos don't know this. Even people are aware that in times when the the shaman feels that there's tremors on the ground. They go on a pilgrim, kandulang, to pray, to say sorry, and ask the sleeping volcano Kitanglad, please don't be angry. Say sorry in behalf of the people of Bukidnon, people of the world. Why? Because our relationship with nature is already messed up. So we are utilitarian. We use nature for our convenience. And very important, if we are really serious with Indigenous education, it's really the essence. It is important. It's knowing the purpose, the direction, and I believe, just like us in the ASW says, the future's Indigenous, because a lot of Indigenous wisdom really just kind of forgo because there's no evidence with it. But for us in the outside world, in the academic community, that is opening the space to learn the also like I've encountered visitors like go to one community, understand the problems and concerns. Like, why should I learn from situations? I'm just here to help. I just want to offer my skills. There's no matches, there's no alignment, and there's no two-way learning. Part of learning is really also reshaping your value system, reshaping your foresight, your insight, and embracing the emergent with your two interactions. Something of the better future emerges, but without those interactions. That's why we still need to stretch our hands and effort to to really build a good relationship with elders. Because if they do not trust the bridges, the mediators to the outside world, then survival link to our humanity, to our resilience, to our survival, that's going to be lost. That's why they do not trust us anymore. And one IP leader also asked me, like, Mister, you never gave up. You just stayed with the tribes. How come? And I said, there are things that I've seen with my own eyes and experienced that even if you're an IP, I've never experienced. And it changed me. And I know that I'm going to stick to that path and find ways that even very little I can connect to the world, what can be said and told about it. The youths now are products of schools for living traditions. They should have a space where they earn the culture from their elders, especially from the ritualists, because they also have, just like Bai when I brought her to DepEd, because there's a DepEd network for Indigenous schools. She just said, like, she came back and said, I want to introduce
Chai, is it
grading.
round up in a minute?
Yeah. I want to introduce grading. She likes grading. Well, why is that buying siya? Yes, because there are prayers on rituals that can be taught to kids. Grading in a sense that they will be, she will know to what level she will learn other serious rituals. So even simple rituals and prayers can be taught to children. So my conclusion to what I shared, it's also very important not to really miss out the element of spirituality. Because when we write for Indigenous education, a program, it's gonna be an indigenous spiritual journey. And if we don't anchor in those philosophy, then we're just kind of change the classroom for Indigenous education. But there's no deep quality level of sharing information. So the cultural masters, the cultural bearers, the cultural experts, the wisdom keepers should have a place to share. Should support, and for us in the mediating field of seeing the wonders of this opportunity, let's find ways to look at what works with less resistance. And it should not be, and that IP story should not be told more about oppression, neglect, There's so much good stories to share. So I think Father Jojo and everyone in the room, Lori, thank you for sharing your knowledge. Very inspiring for me. I felt like my um, 20 years of experience with them is also kind of wrapped up in terms of education. And I know that it's an important aspect to look at advocacy for Indigenous people's rights. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah. Our second respondent is Dr. Willie. Dr. Willie actually is currently lecturing in mathematics because his PhD is actually from the University of the Philippines and the University of Auckland in mathematics and mathematical education. It's also very interesting that he is also somebody who advocates on ethno-mathematics. So please welcome Dr. Willie. Yes, Willie, are you with us?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to the Asian School of Wisdom, and in particular to Father Jojo. Father Jojo, I didn't know you were a priest, so I kept calling you Jojo, but now I know. So
He called me too.
I'm gonna call you Father Jojo from now on. And so thank you for this opportunity, and thank you, Lori, for that comprehensive presentation, and Luna for your insights and for sharing your experiences. So my response is anchored on my being an indigenous person. I'm also a Kankanay, but unlike Lori, I think Lori is from the southern part and I'm from the northern part. No, I'm a northern Kankanay. So I'm a Kankanay and an educator and someone who has been engaged in IP education for almost a decade now. So I'm so happy to listen to Lori's presentation. You could see the wisdom that she has gained for being at the forefront of indigenous people's efforts in the Philippines for quite some time now. But I know that even before she joined IPSEO, or the Indigenous People's Education Office of the Department of Education, she's already been supporting efforts of many schools for indigenous students. In particular, I don't think she mentioned this, but in particular that of Pamanaka, which is a school for Mangyan in San Jose, Occidental Mindoro. I know that she's been there since the beginning of this school. It's been some time since I attended an IPSEO activity, although I've continually been involved in IP education efforts of the Department of Science and Technology, and invitations from Department of Education and teachers from all over the country, as well as my annual engagement with Pamanaka. I'm aware that much has progressed based on the sharing of Lori, but I also know that our teachers are still struggling, in responding to the challenges of what she mentioned earlier, the contextualization, or sometimes they also call it indigenization and localization of their lesson plans, especially in my area, which is mathematics. So this past 3 months, I've been regularly meeting with some math teachers in my region, even with Muslim teachers, and it's really a nice exchange of ideas, and it's a good way to help these math teachers try to indigenize or localize their lesson plans. I'm so happy that even the Muslim teachers who are doing the madrasa are also working on how to make their lessons culturally relevant. Sometimes I have doubts, but when I get to encounter these teachers who are very eager to how to indigenize their lesson plans, then I beat myself up for even doubting myself about IP education. So there are some challenges. They still feel these challenges, but this is hardly surprising. Countries with longer histories of IP education, like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the US, also had difficult beginnings and are today still faced with many challenges and questions in their respective IPED programs. So I would now like to touch on Lori's and my own reflections on the importance of indigenous wisdom for IP education. There's much confluence in our views, so my response will mostly highlight and reinforce what she has already presented. For example, the study of the Episcopal Commission of Indigenous Peoples of the Catholic Bishops' Conference in the Philippines, she mentioned this, on the experiences of Indigenous students on mainstream education, where they reported that, this is worth repeating, the school has been a key venue of discrimination. Schooling has been an experience of non-being, as well as a process of alienation of indigenous youth from their own communities, from their ways of life, from their heritage, culture, and history. So it makes sense for an IP curriculum to be anchored on indigenous wisdom if you want IP education to counter the legacies of mainstream assimilationist Western-based education. But how do we effectively transmit indigenous wisdom? I think Laurie used the word evoke. I think that's a better term than transmit. So I agree. I was reflecting on what she presented, and I agree that the approach in transmitting or evoking indigenous wisdom has to be something that is rooted in the ancestral domain and its indigenous cultural institutions. We cannot discern indigenous wisdom and knowledge if we don't situate this in its cultural milieu. It should encompass worldviews. So wisdom needs to encompass worldviews, history, indigenous knowledge systems, spirituality, and even current issues and struggles of the community. Wisdom to me is the totality of all these aspects of culture and community life. The approach has to embody the sacredness of transmitting indigenous wisdom and knowledge. It should affirm IP identity, which Laurie mentioned several times. There's no sense teaching wisdom if it does not strengthen our indigenous identities. And also it should make use of many forms like stories, art forms, riddles, and chants. No? These forms contain so much wisdom from the community and from the elders. So in the end, we pursue IP education, in particular in the Philippines, because we want to somehow perpetuate, but better revitalize and enhance our indigenous cultures for the next generation, for our communities and our peoples, and also for the nation and the world. We want to expand awareness and understanding about the other IPs in the Philippines and in the world. We want IPED to foster understanding about similarities and differences for our indigenous and indigenous students, for them to learn the importance of diversity, foster respect for other cultures, strengthen their identities as indigenous peoples and as Filipinos, and for them to see their place and role as citizens of a diverse and multicultural world. My final note would reflect on the relationship of land and culture that Laurie mentioned in her presentation. Our indigenous wisdom, our ancestral domain, our ways of life, our spirituality are an important context and content for IP education. That's true. But for indigenous wisdom to persist and for IPED to succeed, we need to protect our ancestral domains and territories. This means that we cannot divorce our efforts for IP education from the overall struggle of IPs in the Philippines to protect their right to their territories and their right to self-determination. Again, this is a theme, an idea that Laurie mentioned about the importance of self-determination. In fact, as we speak, many IP communities are being persecuted. The issues that caused Maclean Dulag to sacrifice his life are still here with us. They're very current and very real. So we might need to lend our voices in support of these communities if we want indigenous wisdom to continue to flourish. So I think I will end my reflection and response here. Thank you again, Laurie, for that very comprehensive presentation and this opportunity to reflect on what you presented. Thank you.
So much, yeah. Thank you so much. We have time now. Thank you, Dr. Billy. Yeah, thank you so much, yeah, for your reflection and connecting to even your Kankanai root, and experiences. We have time now for a conversation now where you would like to engage our speakers, and I had the pleasure to invite Miss Maria Gracia Virginia, from Indonesia. Would you like to ask your question? Maria.
Okay.
Yes. Terima kasih.
Okay, thank you, Father, for this opportunity. First, there's a lot of education that I've got from Ma'am Lori about the indigenous people and all the educations. And what I really want to know is there any criteria from the organization or community for people to giving education to indigenous people? Because I've just realized that indigenous peoples in this era is already got a lot of education that I've never known before. I just thought that they have to protect their territory and their existence. But time by time, I just realized that they got a lot of education from community or organization. And my question is there any criteria? If it's not, am I as a young generation can be participated to give education for indigenous people? Thank you.
Lori, would you like to address that?
Thank you, Maria Gracia. I just like to check if I understood your question correctly. So in the Philippines, we have learners who are, let's say, in the public school or in the private school. So your question is, are there criteria for them to go to school? Is that what you meant?
Yeah, to giving the education for indigenous people.
Okay. Okay. Um, to go to school, let's say in the Philippines, so to go to school, in the public school, anybody can go to school. So, of course, there are things that have to be submitted, but by policy, the government, a government school cannot turn away learners or parents who bring their children. So there's no how will I put it? There's no criteria such that if you do not meet the criteria, you cannot go to school. That's by policy, that's not allowed. Of course, in the private schools, they may have certain requirements or they may have certain uh, criteria depending on their priorities or depending on sometimes they have reasons why they choose certain types of learners and not others. No, but in the public school system, anyone who wants to go to school or is brought by parents, it is the duty of the state to uh, include them in the school. Now, the IP Ed program, the Indigenous Peoples Education Program, is being implemented for now. No, for now as a start because it also takes a lot of work. For now, we are implementing it, especially in schools where there are a dominant number of IT learners. But later on, we intend to expand this to other schools where, even actually in schools where the population of IT learners is low. Let's say they're just, let's say in a population of 200 learners, and let's say you only have 10 IT learners in that school, there are ways to address their concerns in terms of cultural sensitivity and even their use of the language. So the IPED program intends to address the needs and concerns of IT learners, no matter whether they are many or they're just one or two, let's say in a school. But it takes time. So right now, most of our efforts are with the schools that are dominantly IP learners. And then there are a few schools also already now trying out approaches in a context or in a setting where the IP learners may not be that many by number. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. So technically, if I want to giving education for indigenous people, then I have to going to some public or private school, as you have said, right? And
if you were an IP learner, if you were the
yeah,
learner, yes, you have a choice. You can go to a public school or to a private school. And in the public school system, there should be no reason to say you cannot enroll. You should be accepted by the public school. In the private school, there may be some requirements or some criteria.
okay. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. All right. Thanks. Any other person who would like to make a comment or ask a question? This is your time, yeah?
Okay. Judith from Malaysia. Yeah. As I was listening to you, Laurie, and the other respondents, it looks very much like we send our children to be educated, right? And yet the education is the problem. So I was just thinking that because it's so challenging, and when we look at education, the whole understanding of education is so boxed in, and it's so conditioned that when we go to school, we are to learn. Learn what? And especially during this time of pandemic, the reality comes true. It's like we have actually destroyed land. We have, everything is so unsustainable. And it is maybe at this time to relook at what is education, to question, is there an alternative way of learning? Because really, listening to yourselves, it brings together wisdom. It brings together that whole idea of when you said spirituality is at the center, and all that we know is held together. And it's so true. And, like for myself, one of the reasons for being a participant in this forum is basically because, for me, I've come to an understanding after years of my own spirituality, that it is where the indigenous, the community is what life is all about. It's where the whole essence of meaning of life. And when you also said, water is a being and all of nature is a being, it's so beautiful, because that's really the essence of where the whole of humanity needs to be brought into at this point, of knowing that we are actually destroying what the IDP, the indigenous people, have actually been grown from, and just because of sending them, the younger people, into schools, it has actually distorted a whole idea of what education is. And of course, when you go into schools, we are looking at the whole question of growth. We are saying that, by going to for education, you grow in this, but we actually stop growing in life. And if we become so mind conscious that we have forgotten that whole spirit of what life is all about and that whole wisdom. I mean, I have no questions because, I don't know where to go from here as well. But I'm very blessed that we have actually, like Father Jojo, when y'all started the School of Wisdom. And I think it is a very important platform, and more people need to be brought into this platform. And I'm so glad too, our friend from Indonesia, is here and young, because I think, there are people like us who are already seniors, but it'll be really good to really build up the School of Wisdom. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Jude. Yeah. Any one of you would like to comment? Be it
Brother Dixon, I think, was raising his hand earlier.
correct? Yes. Willie, do you want to respond before I ask Dixon?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that reflection, Judith. And I was thinking while you were speaking that part of what we're doing really is healing. We want IP education because we want to heal the damage that has been wrought to us by Western education. We need to heal the environment, the damage that we have done to our territories if we want wisdom to flourish. So I think a big part of what we're doing now is really to heal the mind, to heal the land, and to heal all of us, so that we move forward in this quest for a spiritual, a spiritual and culturally enriched life. So I think part of this really is, a lot of this is healing.
Yeah, healing, restructuring, rethinking, reimagining, all that. Yeah. I'll call on Dixon then. You have a question, Dixon?
I was just, can you hear me first?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to also really highlighted what they already said. It bring me much hope just to hear from all three of you, especially started with you, the first speaker. And I think Father Church already know most of my lamentation and kind of like struggle in understanding this Western educational system. And yeah, I think that what Dr. Willie already mentioned just briefly recently was that the healing is really the key word that stood out for me, because like I shared in the last Saturday's Zoom, it was that's my struggle too, is that I thought I'm going to school because I'll be educated and come back and educate my people, but it's the reverse is what happened to me. I actually realized along the way that I was actually disconnected from my root as an indigenous myself. I realized I've learned a different way that it take me away, uprooted me from my own root. And so hearing from you, Marie, it was just good because my background also is in education, and I'm happy that you're working in that field to really like brought up more of it. And I was a little bit worried that maybe in Philippines they're not going to be accepting what you're working the program of like integrating these indigenous. But when toward the end of it, it was good to see that how that actually transitioned, and now it's more acceptable, I guess, in the Philippines education program. So I'm happy to see that, because that was one of my interests to see if I could help out in my own territory, especially in education level. And it's just good to see more hopes in there, because all three of you highlighted that just in this presentation, and even the one from last time. So yeah, it's true. I agree totally that healing is really the key here, because it seems like we're moving backward. And one of the Jesuit that Father Chocho has us at least read in our course last summer was he's a young Jesuit, and he said that indigenous is the way, and I actually believe it's the way for us today. Is to actually solve this educational system. It has to be really emphasizing this indigenous way of education system. So I guess I just wanted to highlight it and point all you said, and I'm happy to hear it. Especially now I'm doing my study, I'm trying to figure out how to even work on my own theology, because I feel like even theology is not quite good in some sense here. Excuse me, those of you who are attending Ateneo. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. You want to say something, which island you're from? And
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I'm from Micronesia, and so I'm your neighbor. I'm from a very small island of Yap State, and so of course that's my lifestyle is depending on fishing, and so it's all like indigenous way, just living simply. And the only thing brought me to school is because I passed the entrance test to the college, and my parents, since they don't have to look for money, so they say you should go because the college will pay you since you passed the test. So that's what brought me to college, and from there I met more Jesuit, and I decided to join the Jesuit after finishing up my PA in education. So I have a PA before joining the Jesuit in education. So here I am doing theology at Ateneo, along with Tuan. Tuan is also with us from Vietnam. Thank you
so much. Yeah. Anybody else wants to make a comment, ask a question?
Can I? This is Rakawin from Bangkok.
Yes, my goodness, Rakawin.
Sawadika. I just, thank you very much for all the speakers. I felt very inspiring from what they said. I just would like to, for them to discuss a little bit on, the discrimination of these indigenous children in the school. And I feel that this is something that maybe we have to find a good solution to that. How do we bring the solidarity of the indigenous and non-indigenous children, because they are still young and they should learn from these days, the school days, how they can care for each other, how they understand each other. I think this is something that I don't know whether the speakers can really share these experiences. I have one in Laos that I used to work, and I think in the public school they they do the peer groups, like they have a few students of the Laotian and the indigenous taking care of each other. It's a kind of assignment, and I heard that they learn a lot from one another also. I mean, and this is something that I just thought when I heard that there is this kind of issue of discrimination in the schools, against IP children. So just leave this for sharing from the speakers. Thank you very much.
Yes, can you respond? Any one of you? Laurie, where are you? Would you like to respond?
Okay. So I'd like to tie some of the reflections that have been shared. Sir Willie mentioned about healing, no? And Dixon also resonates with that. And that is also actually one point of reflection that is now more, it's more and more becoming a point of sharing, even in the department. Earlier, in the earlier years of the IP Ed program, there was a tendency to look more into the technical aspect of, the education process, But in the recent years, starting 2019, the theme of healing and reconciliation is more and more coming to the fore, because really, if we look at the process, and this is related to discrimination, like if we are to understand, if IP Ed is to move forward, it will really have to move into that area where we need to confront how we have been broken by these historical circumstances. And therefore, as a whole country, we have to reflect on it together, and see how we all have been wounded actually. And therefore, the healing also will involve all of us. So that kind of articulation is slowly asking to be shared. And interestingly, it has to do also with what Sir Willie was also discussing about the struggles really of communities in their ancestral domains. So as that articulation is becoming more explicit, it is important that we are able to feel and flow with it. So there is the technical aspect, of course, of education, the curriculum, assessment, all these things. But if we are clear also, if we are able to feel that dimension, there's a way of handling these technical things, but the way it comes across is really towards that process of healing and reconciliation. But yeah, it will mean being really in touch also with the woundedness, but also being able to feel how the healing is happening, how the healing is emerging, and that will require now that dimension of spirituality, because one cannot go into that movement of healing without really touching base with that sense of the spiritual dimension. So personally, I'm hoping that sense will permeate the IP education advocacy process more and more. At least one space that is happening, at least in the public school arena, is at least, especially in schools that are in IP communities themselves, where they're dominantly, the IP learners are there and the school is within the community itself. More and more, there is an openness for the spiritual expression of the communities. So, for example, during the pandemic, So we had the pandemic, right? And in the Philippines, classes, schools were not, schools were done at home, but classes started in October last year, the first time. And it so happens in the Philippines, October is what we call Indigenous Peoples Month. So what happened in several communities, they decided to open the school year and celebrate, in a way, celebrate Indigenous Peoples Month by actually holding rituals in the school. So in different parts of the country where it was possible, because of course, if the infection is high, you cannot do it. But even then, we were asking the community elders, if we cannot do it in one area, can we do it at least in your homes? And like it becomes a communal expression. So that happened last year, where the opening of the school year in several areas was actually ritualized. And so there are these spaces that are there, and um I think we will need to nurture those spaces and allow for the growth of that deeper understanding emerging from practice. And in a way, the pandemic is doing that. It's really pushing us to be more mindful of what really is fundamental and essential, in living, and what it means, the meaning making, I think, is we are being pushed to really be more reflective in our meaning making. So um, all these things are interweaving. So while the pandemic is really difficult, uh, I'm also sensing that there is that flow for, as you were saying, of healing and regeneration. And I think that is what we will need to touch base with. And for those people who are church people, actively church people, there's this one area that I think we will need to work on. And again, I will go back to that call. Can because I shared this in one venue a few weeks ago. When we were doing our trainings with our teachers and school heads in the early years of the IP Ed program, 2013, 2014, I was actually surprised when not once, this did not happen only once. It happened several times. That's why it also caught my attention. We had participants who actually raised their hand and said, I will have a difficulty implementing the IPED program because it conflicts with my belief. I mean, because the way, the view of, let's say, indigenous peoples being pagan, when you wear the attire, for some, when you wear the attire, that's already a pagan practice, things like that. So we have encountered personnel who have shared that feeling, that weight. And and I was surprised more because I was thinking that more of the questions would be the technical side, debating about the curriculum and all of that. But when I heard that question and it came several times, it really becomes clear that that dimension also needs to be healed. And for us in the Department of Education, there is something that we can do, yes, but it also requires the the faith sector, the faith communities also to contribute. So hopefully, in this discussion of healing, or in this move towards healing, uh, hopefully more church groups will also contribute. So while we do our part in the education realm, uh, we can connect with that dimension, but hopefully the faith groups will also find ways to contribute to that healing. Thank you.
So much, Laurie. Yeah, thank you. Yes. Um, we also have another indigenous person, Judy Fine. She is actually with Kings, no? Kings, would you like to say anything at all to us? Yeah, fine.
Good evening. I'm very thankful to have attended this forum. Thank you very much, Miss Lori and Sir Willie, and to Chai. What I am excited about is what Chai mentioned about putting into document the stories of the IPs. So I would like to be updated on that because it is very enriching, and I'm sure the youth will be um, very excited of that in to read the stories of their ancestors. And also I agree that because most of the IP members in Bukidnon are elderly already, I am very supportive of that they should have to come up with a book, or well uh well, I know for a fact that Kin as an NGO has already compiled a lot of stories, and I think they have already some books released. But the one Chai has mentioned about the coming up with more stories of their ancestors, I'm very excited of that.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Good. So Chai, thank you for doing all the documentation. At the same time, it's become resources, and especially our the culture-based education. Also, and Chai, you're doing a lot, to bring people into that atmosphere of learning. It's amazing what you mentioned about journeys. Um, yes, thank you for doing all that. Just one last question, perhaps, or comment, and then we will close for the day. Any more questions? Thank you. Judy, fine. Thank you. Yeah, just to remind everybody that the next session will be Saturday, 27 November. 27 November. So we are featuring Dr. Sunton. Sunton is actually a Karen from the Indigenous tribe in Chiang Mai. Chiang Mai. So he will speak in terms of how, through the ancestral wisdom, they're recreating sacred space. And it's amazing what the Karen communities are doing in northern Thailand, and especially they recreate sacred space through a very powerful movement. It's called the Rice Merit Network as well, which is still in practice. So it's wisdom in practice in terms of the Rice Merit Network. So I hope that you can come on board as well. So we'll send out the reminders to you. Yeah. Also give us some feedback as to whether Saturday is a good time, whether 4 p.m. is a good time for you, or do we need to change time and day as well. So
Jojo, just now I saw Alan raise her hand.
Alan, where are you? Would you like to say something, Alan? Alan or Alin? Don? Alan or Alin? Which one?
Yeah, Dr. Arlene.
Dr. Alin. Okay, sure. Okay.
Mama, you are muted. Could you please unmute?
Sorry.
Yes.
I would like to say thank you, Lori. Again, we met virtually, although we have met sometime in other occasions. And I hope you stay long at the depth ed, so that the things that you have started would really take root, and let that healing really go on. I am telling this because from my experience in 2001, I had the experience of joining the National Indigenous Conference here in the Philippines. So it was a non-IP group who started this. And so when I heard about the depth ed, IP depth at depth ed, I was so happy that someone who's there is also an IP herself. And so I was thinking, okay, the small seed that was started before then had had started to grow and hopefully will come to fruition, so that all will really see the goodness, the wisdom, and hopefully that discrimination, as one mentioned earlier, would somehow not be there anymore, but we see eye to eye as one in the journey. And thank you also for Dr. Willie for sharing also his experience.
Right, indeed, yeah. So with that, from Dr. Alind, and then on the behalf of all of us in ASW and those who are participating in this co-learning series, our heartfelt gratitude to actually to Laurie, to Chai, and to Willie. Huh? So thank you for for being there with us in ASW, Asian School of Wisdom, and pray that this efforts will funnel up, because I think the United Nations, the COP, they need kind of wisdom. They're not consulting the indigenous people. No one indigenous leaders or elders or wisdom keeper is invited to the COP 26 in Glasgow, Scotland. No one. So we hope that in 10 years' time, if there's any COP anymore, I think indigenous wisdom keepers must be part of that conversation. Yes. So with that, I thank you all, and may kabunyan
Thank you.
all of us. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.